Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling some pretty heavy philosophical hitters.
Yeah, definitely. We're looking at that whole fascination, especially in 20th century French philosophy, with the negative or nothingness. Thinkers like Hegel, or at least Hegel through Kojève, Sartre, Camus.
Right. They all seem to find something really profound there, like the power to say no, to negate things. That was somehow the key to human freedom, to authenticity.
Exactly. It's this idea that, unlike an animal or an object, humans aren't just there. We can deny the given, we can desire what's absent. And this led to this, well, this project you could almost call the humanization of nothingness.
Humanization of nothingness. What does that actually mean?
It's this ambitious attempt to ground human dignity, maybe even a kind of godliness, not in spirit or soul in the old sense, but precisely in our ability to negate, in our mortality or lack. It's a sort of atheistic humanism built on what we aren't.
Okay, got it. But we're not just tracing that history today. Our guide is René Girard, who had a radically different take.
Radically different is putting it mildly. Girard looked at this whole celebration of the negative and said, hold on. He argued it wasn't profound insight at all, but actually a kind of intellectual error, a symptom, he called it.
A symptom of something deeper.
Yeah, a symptom of a hidden human pathology, something we don't want to admit about ourselves. And this isn't just academic nitpicking. It cuts right to how we see ourselves in the modern world.
So what's his core argument? The roadmap for this deep dive?
It's pretty stark. He basically says, and this is almost a direct quote, the negative which so many modern philosophers identify with freedom and life is in reality the herald of slavery and death.
Wow. Okay, so freedom is actually slavery. Life leads to death. That flips everything on its head.
It really does. Our job today is to unpack why he believed that. Why did he see this philosophical path, this worship of nothingness, as leading straight to self-destruction?
All right, so before we get into Girard's critique, we need to understand what exactly he was arguing against. Where did this idea of the negative as this, liberating force really come from?
Well, its modern power really stems from German idealism, specifically Hegel, but maybe even more importantly, how Hegel was read and interpreted, particularly by Alexandre Kojève in Paris in the 1930s.
Kojève's lectures were hugely influential, right?
Massively. And Kojève crystallized this idea, negation, the mental act of saying no, is what fundamentally separates humans from animals, from nature. An object just is. It's identical to itself. But human consciousness, it can deny what's given. It can transcend that static reality.
So nature is just being, en soi, as they'd say. But human consciousness, the pour soi, it's defined by difference, by lack, by denial.
Precisely. And crucially, desire gets tied up in this. For Kojève, following this line of thought, desire is the negation of the given. I desire something because I don't have it. I lack it.
And that lack is a sign of freedom. Because I can imagine something that isn't here right now.
That's the logic. The freedom to negate, to imagine what's not, defines human desire. And by extension, it defines what it means to be human in this philosophical tradition. That's the cornerstone Girard is challenging.
Okay. But surely not everyone bought into this idea that desire is fundamentally about lack or negativity.
Oh, absolutely not. You get a strong counter-reaction. Thinkers like Gilles Deleuze, drawing heavily on Nietzsche, argue that this whole framing is, well, flawed from the start.
How so?
Deleuze basically said that linking desire to lack is a symptom of philosophies based on resentment, like Platonism or Christianity, or even this Hegelian view. He argued that true desire isn't about filling a void, it's affirmative, it's creative, productive. It's a positive force making new realities.
So for Deleuze, negativity isn't the engine of desire, it's more like a byproduct.
Yeah.
Or maybe a misunderstanding.
Yeah, maybe a shadow cast by language or a projection of psychological resentment onto what is actually a vibrant creative force. Desire produces, it doesn't just negate.
Okay, so we have Hegel Kojève seeing the negative as rational freedom, Deleuze seeing its resentment, and then there's Georges Bataille, who takes it somewhere else entirely, right? Somewhere darker.
Oh, definitely darker. Bataille is fascinating because he accepts the link between negativity and desire, but he absolutely rejects Hegel's attempt to make it rational or productive in a dialectical sense. For Bataille, the negative is the excess, the destructive part of being human that can't be contained.
Excess, like pure waste or something.
Exactly. Pure expenditure, sovereignty found in destruction, a kind of sacred, non-useful squandering of energy. He linked it directly to violence, transgression, things like murder, carnage, death, and ruin. He basically accused Hegel of trying to tame this wild, irrational dimension of desire, of failing to see its truly dark side.
So three very different takes: rational freedom, linguistic resentment, or irrational destruction. How does Girard navigate this? Where does he fit in?
This is where Girard's genius, I think, really shows. He sort of synthesizes and refutes them all at once. He agrees with Bataille that, yes, the negative often manifests as destructive and violent.
Okay.
He also agrees with Deleuze, in a way, that unacknowledged resentment or psychological dynamics often fuel the philosophical embrace of negativity. But, and this is the crucial Girardian move, he rejects the idea that desire is fundamentally affirmative and spontaneous, like Deleuze thought. And he rejects the idea that this destructive negativity is purely irrational or beyond explanation, like Bataille suggested.
Why? Was his alternative explanation?
It all comes down to one thing for Girard: imitation, mimetic desire. He argues that these dark, destructive impulses, this experience of lack or excess, aren't intrinsic features of being human. They have a clear, traceable logic.
And that logic is?
It's the logic of rivalry. The negative, in whichever philosophical costume it appears, is ultimately just the name we give to the symptoms that arise when our desires, which are fundamentally imitative, become conflictual and competitive. It's not some abstract principle, it's the fallout from hidden social competition.
Wow. So he's saying the philosophers celebrating the negative are basically describing the smoke without seeing the fire of rivalry underneath.
That's a great way to put it. Which brings us squarely to Girard's core concepts. How does this imitative desire actually lead to destruction?
Okay, so if Girard's whole critique hinges on imitation, we need to start with his most famous idea: triangular desire, mimetic desire.
It's absolutely foundational. You can't understand his critique of the negative without it. Forget the simple subject-object picture of desire. For Girard, it's always subject-model-object, or disciple-mediator-object, as he sometimes puts it.
So I don't just want the promotion.
Yeah.
I want it because my colleague, my model, seems to want it, or has it, and their desiring it makes it desirable to me.
Exactly. Desire isn't spontaneous, it's learned, it's copied, it's mediated. And the nature of that mediation, the relationship between the disciple and the model, determines everything.
And this is where the distinction between external and internal mediation comes in. That's key to whether desire stays sort of healthy or turns toxic.
Absolutely crucial. External mediation is when the model is far away, untouchable. Think of, a historical figure, a saint, maybe a distant celebrity you admire. There's a clear gap.
So you admire them, you might even imitate their virtues or style, but you're not actually competing with them for the same things.
Right. The distance prevents rivalry. The desire is structured by the model, but it remains relatively peaceful, maybe even productive. Think apprenticeship. Learning from a master you don't dream of replacing immediately.
But Girard argues that the modern world is characterized by the collapse of that distance.
Precisely. As traditional hierarchies flatten, as democratic ideals spread, as society becomes more egalitarian, that safe distance shrinks. This leads to internal mediation.
Meaning the model is now close by.
Yes, a peer, a friend, a neighbor, a colleague, someone in your immediate social sphere. And this proximity changes everything. Suddenly, you are potentially competing for the same objects, the same job, the same social status, the same partner, whatever.
And the imitation becomes more intense.
Yeah.
And maybe hidden.
Both. It becomes reciprocal. They might start imitating you too, unconsciously. And because rivalry is emerging, acknowledging the imitation becomes taboo. You deny you're copying them, they deny they're copying you. And crucially, the model, sensing the disciple getting too close, starts to feel threatened.
So the model instinctively tries to block the disciple.
Yes. They become an obstacle. And this is the pivotal moment. The mediator transforms into the model obstacle.
And the desire shifts. It's not just about the object anymore.
The object itself starts to fade. Maybe you didn't even want it that much initially. The real focus becomes the model obstacle. The desire becomes metaphysical. It's not about having what they have. It's about being what they seem to be. Autonomous, self-sufficient, the one who can possess the object, the one who has the power to block me.
That sounds intense and potentially pathological.
It leads directly to what Girard calls the manie de l'obstacle, obstacle addiction. This is where the negative really takes hold psychologically.
Obstacle addiction, meaning you become hooked on the feeling of being blocked.
It's a perverse but very powerful dynamic. The value of the whole enterprise, the object, the rivalry, starts to depend entirely on the model obstacle's ability to resist, to negate the disciple. If the obstacle gives way easily, the desire fizzles out, their prestige collapses.
But if they resist strongly, if they really block you,
Then the fascination intensifies. The obstacle seems even more powerful, more desirable in its being. The disciple becomes obsessed with the very thing that denies them. Admiration and hatred become intertwined. It's a repetitive, irresistible cycle.
That's a chilling thought. It means the ultimate fuel for desire isn't attainment, but negation itself.
Yes. And if you follow that logic to its extreme conclusion, what is the thing that negates me the most? What obstacle possesses the most absolute power over my existence seems the most self-sufficient?
Death.
Death. The ultimate impenetrable obstacle. Girard states it bluntly. The truth of metaphysical desire is death. The end point of this addictive cycle isn't fulfillment. It's the density of lead, the impenetrable immobility of granite. Death becomes the ultimate rival, the ultimate model obstacle, because it seems to possess the absolute being and negating power the disciple craves.
Okay, we have to pause here. Because if Girard is right, this completely reframes things like Freud's concept of the death instinct, doesn't it?
It's a direct challenge, absolutely. Freud observed self-destructive patterns, this compulsion to repeat painful experiences, and posited an innate drive, Thanatos, pulling us back towards the inanimate, independent of pleasure.
But Girard says we don't need that explanation.
He argues it's an unnecessary abstraction. For Girard, there's no mysterious death instinct pulling the strings. The self-destructive behavior, the repetition compulsion, it's not some innate drive. It's a result, a pathological complication, he calls it.
Complication is what?
Of getting stuck in the mechanics of internal mediation, of obstacle addiction. The compulsion to repeat isn't a drive towards death itself. It's the automatic, unconscious repetition of the rivalrous pattern. When you're constantly thwarted by the model obstacle, you keep escalating, you inject more intensity, more violence into the desire, and that cycle, if unchecked, logically culminates in the ultimate negations. Destruction of the rival or destruction of the self.
So the apparent drive towards death is actually a symptom of a breakdown in human relationships, driven by hidden imitation and rivalry. We're mistaking the disease for a fundamental part of our nature.
Precisely. It's rooted in intersubjectivity, not biology. And understanding that historical context, how this dynamic became not just prevalent but philosophically celebrated, is our next step.
All right, so we have the psychological engine, mimetic desire leading to obstacle addiction, culminating in a fascination with negation and death. But how did this psychological pattern become, well, philosophically respectable? How did Western thought end up seemingly celebrating this destructive cycle?
Girard traces a historical arc, starting significantly with the rise of the modern individual, often pinpointed to Descartes.
Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Grounding everything in subjective experience.
Right. Radical doubt leads to the certainty of the self, which is powerful, obviously, foundational for modern science and rationality. But Girard sees an unintended consequence. By making subjective experience the ultimate benchmark, it paradoxically increases our need for external validation, for models.
Wait, how does rational individualism lead to more need for models? That seems counterintuitive.
Because if my own isolated consciousness is the starting point, how do I know what to desire? How do I navigate a complex world? Rationality tells me how to achieve goals, but not which goals are worth pursuing. The old, stable, divinely ordained models are fading. So we look around. We look to others.
We start relying on experts, on social cues, on what seems prestigious.
Exactly. Girard sees the rise of the cult of experts and the general obsession with status and opinion as part of this unconscious cult of model obstacles. We're desperately seeking external cues to shore up our supposedly autonomous inner world. The more rationalized the world becomes, the more we secretly crave guidance.
And this really ramps up after the Enlightenment, when those traditional vertical models, God, king, fixed social hierarchies, really start to crumble.
That's the crucial shift. Vertical transcendence, where models were distant and stable, gives way to horizontal immanence. Everyone is theoretically equal. Everyone can choose their own models or even claim, I need no model, I am self-made.
But that claim itself is often a denial, right?
It's often the strongest denial. Because in this flattened social landscape, everyone is potentially a model and a rival. Internal mediation becomes the default condition. Proximity breeds imitation, which breeds rivalry, which necessitates denying the imitation to maintain the illusion of autonomy.
So the more we imitate, the more fiercely we deny it.
Precisely. And this creates what Girard, borrowing from Dostoevsky, sees as an underground psychology. People become masters of self-deception, using sophisticated intellectual tools to rationalize their own obstacle addiction, to justify their resentment and their need to negate others while claiming absolute independence.
Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground is the classic example. The narrator who sabotages himself just to prove he's free from rational self-interest.
It's the perfect literary diagnosis. The underground man is drowning in resentment, obsessed with the obstacles, real or imagined, posed by others, pathologically committed to negating any model of behavior, especially the enlightened ones. He's addicted to the failure, the negation, because it feels like freedom from imitation. He embodies the monde de l'obstacle.
Okay, so this psychological dynamic is simmering beneath the surface of modernity. How does it then erupt into philosophy, into this idea of deviated transcendency?
Deviated transcendency is Girard's term for what happens when the human drive for transcendence, the desire to connect with something absolute, something foundational, gets rerouted after the death of God. If there's no transcendent God to provide ontological grounding, where does that drive go?
It turns inward. The self tries to become its own God.
Exactly. The self attempts to usurp the divine prerogative, to declare, I am W-O-I am. The longing for the absolute doesn't disappear. It's just redirected onto the horizontal plane, into the world of human relationships. We seek that ultimate validation, that sense of absolute being from each other. Tragically, as Girard puts it, people become gods in the eye of each other.
And this is the point of convergence. The individual's will to self-divinization crashes headlong into the hidden pathology of mimetic rivalry.
That's the catastrophic collision. The powerful, often unconscious drive of obstacle addiction finds expression within philosophical discourse. Philosophers, caught in these same mimetic webs but unaware of the underlying mechanics, start interpreting the results of this rivalry, the negation, the conflict, the fascination with death, not as symptoms, but as evidence of human freedom, authenticity, or even self-divinization.
They mistake the pathology for profundity.
They essentially sacralize the obstacle. Death, the ultimate obstacle, gets recast not as the enemy, but as the confirmation of human sovereignty. The philosophical quest for self-affirmation, driven by the hidden engine of rivalry, ends up championing self-negation.
As Girard chillingly puts it, the affirmation of the self ends in the negation of self. The will to make oneself God is a will to self-destruction.
Which is gradually realized. The celebration of nothingness becomes the ultimate intellectual alibi for a process rooted in mimetic conflict. #tag for Hegel's master-slave dialectic re-examined.
Okay, so to really dismantle this philosophical tradition, Girard knows he has to go back to one of its key origin points.
Yeah.
Hegel's master-slave dialectic in the phenomenology of spirit. This is often seen as the foundational story about how self-consciousness emerges through conflict, right?
Absolutely. It's the locus classicus. The standard interpretation, largely thanks to Kojève again, is this. Two consciousnesses meet, and they inevitably enter a life-or-death struggle for pure recognition to prove their independence from biological life.
One risks death and wins the master. The other fears death and submits the slave.
Right. The master achieves immediate but ultimately limited recognition. The slave, forced into servitude, seems to lose. But Hegel argues the slave actually undergoes a more profound transformation.
How so? What's the slave's supposed advantage?
By confronting death, the absolute lord, the slave experiences absolute negativity. This terror, this feeling of utter dissolution, shakes their entire being and makes them realize their consciousness is fundamentally nothingness maintained in being. It's a universalizing experience of fear.
And this fear, combined with a discipline of work of shaping the material world for the master, eventually leads the slave to a higher, more universal form of self-consciousness and freedom, while the master just stays stuck, consuming.
That's the standard narrative. The slave's encounter with nothingness is the crucible of freedom.
But Girard looks at this struggle and says, this isn't about abstract recognition at all.
Not primarily. He insists the whole encounter is utterly mimetic from start to finish. It's not two abstract consciousnesses seeking philosophical recognition. It's two rivals escalating their conflict because they are imitating each other's desire for dominance, for perceived self-sufficiency.
They're obstacle addicts, blinded to their mutual dependency.
Exactly. They're locked in a symmetrical conflict, each one functioning as the model obstacle for the other, driving the violence upwards. They think they're fighting for pure independence, but they're actually bound together by their reciprocal imitation.
Okay, but hold on. Isn't Hegel deliberately abstracting the scenario? Doesn't he need to remove the messy details like pain or luck to isolate the philosophical point about the fear of death being the key to realizing freedom? If the slave just gave up because they were tired or got unlucky, doesn't that ruin the whole philosophical insight?
That's precisely Girard's point. Hegel has to abstract it. He has to strip away the concrete reality of the violence, the pain, the blood, the exhaustion, the sheer chance involved in any fight to make it seem like the only reason for surrender could be the abstract philosophical fear of death itself.
Because only that abstract fear carries the universal philosophical weight he needs for the dialectic.
Yes. By removing the contingent, mimetic, and physical realities of the fight, he can isolate fear of death and elevate it into this profound, consciousness-altering experience. But Girard says, if you put the real human dynamics back in, common sense tells you people surrender for all sorts of reasons rooted in the immediate violent interaction with their rival, not just contemplation of abstract nothingness.
So what Hegel presents as a universal moment of philosophical awakening is with Girard actually more like a description of a psychological state induced by intense, violent rivalry.
Exactly. And specifically, that profound experience the slave has absolute negativity. Nothingness maintained in being isn't some glimpse into the universal structure of consciousness. It's the slave's internalized experience of the master as the overwhelming model obstacle.
Meaning the slave isn't contemplating death in the abstract, but fearing violent death at the hands of the master.
Yes. The master, in that moment, embodies absolute power, the power of life and death over the slave. That's the absolute lord the slave experiences. The nothingness is the slave's feeling of utter powerlessness in relation to the rival, the projection of their own lack onto the master's perceived invulnerability.
So that celebrated phrase, nothingness maintained in being, isn't about universal freedom. It's the slave's subjective feeling of being negated by the triumphant rival, an internalized symptom of the rivalry.
It's the psychological imprint of the model obstacle. The slave feels like nothing, precisely because they project everything, ultimate being, ultimate negating power onto the master. It's a product of the mimetic crisis, not a gateway to freedom.
And Girard even points to Bataille agreeing on this, that you can't really experience death while alive.
Right. Bataille made the point that death itself, being absolute cessation, can't actually reveal anything to a living consciousness. Claiming the slave experiences death's absolute negativity directly is what Bataille called an impossible experience. It's a philosophical construct, not a psychological reality.
So the devastating conclusion for this whole line of thought is,
Negativity, as conceptualized by Hegel in this crucial passage, is an illusory byproduct. It's an artifact generated by the unacknowledged, intensely conflictual desire between rivals. As Girard puts it starkly, the negative is the desire of the slave, the desire born from being dominated by a human model obstacle.
and if that's true, then the negative can't possibly be the foundation of freedom or autonomy because its very structure reveals our deep, often pathological dependence on others.
Exactly. It confirms our mediated nature rather than our independence.
Okay, so if Girard argues the Hegelian foundation is built on a misreading of rivalry, how did this concept of the negative get amplified later, specifically by Kojève and Sartre, into this full-blown humanization of nothingness?
Well, Kojève, as we saw, took Hegel's ideas, particularly the master-slave dialectic and the concept of the end of history, and pushed them towards an almost literal atheistic humanism. He saw world history as the process of humanity realizing its own divine potential.
Replacing God with man, essentially.
Quite literally. He famously said something like, man must realize in himself what at first he thought was realized in his God. To be really Christian, he himself must become Christ. It's a radical appropriation of divine attributes.
And the key attribute man uses to achieve this self-divinization is negativity.
Precisely. Kojève doubles down on the idea. Man is a nothingness that annihilates. That's his definition. Desire is pure negation of the given. Therefore, freedom, desire, and death become fundamentally intertwined, almost equivalent. To be truly free, truly human, is to embrace your power to negate, ultimately embodied in the acceptance and even the courting of death.
Because death is the ultimate no to limits, to being just an object.
Right. It's seen as the ultimate proof of freedom from mere biological necessity.
But Girard sees a massive contradiction here, doesn't he? Human essence is pure negation. Where does that actually lead?
It leads to a dead end, logically and existentially. If desire is purely negative, it can only negate. It can't build, it can't affirm, it can't even achieve stable recognition with another negating consciousness. How can two nothings recognize each other? Ultimately, if you follow the logic, pure negativity must negate itself. It points towards self-destruction.
So the philosophy becomes a kind of intellectual suicide note.
In a sense, yes. Girard argues that Kojève provides this incredibly lucid, almost prophetic account of where radical individualism, rooted in this concept of the negative, must inevitably lead towards nihilism and self-destruction. But Kojève himself seems unaware of the mimetic engine driving this trajectory. He describes the destination without seeing the rivalrous path that led there.
So Koyev and others mistake the end-stage symptom, the obsession with negation and death arising from intense, frustrated rivalry for the fundamental cause or essence of human freedom.
Exactly. They reverse the order, Girard would say. Imitation comes first. Then comes the conflict, the obstacle addiction, the resulting fascination with negation. And lastly comes the philosophical theory that elevates that symptom into a first principle about humanity.
Okay, let's bring in Sartre. His existentialism is maybe the most famous popularization of these ideas. The en soi versus the pour soi.
Right. Sartre's ontology hinges on this split. The en soi, in itself, is the world of things. Solid, static, non-conscious, just being there. The pour soi, for itself, is human consciousness. Fluid, dynamic, defined by its freedom, its ability to negate the en soi. Consciousness is a lack, a hole in being.
It's always striving away from the stickiness of being.
Yes, its essence is its freedom, its non-identity with anything fixed.
So how does Girard reinterpret Sartre's en soi and pour soi through the lens of mimetic desire?
He basically demystifies the whole thing, that solid, imposing en soi that consciousness is constantly negating. Girard says that's simply the image of the model obstacle. It's the perceived solidity, the frustrating impenetrability, the apparent self-sufficiency of the rival that the disciple consciousness, pour soi, is obsessed with and trying to overcome or negate.
So the en soi's power isn't objective, it's projected onto it by the desirous pour soi.
Precisely. The en soi is just the obstacle that the masochist avidly seeks and on which he remains fixed, as Girard puts it. The pour soi's power to negate isn't some inherent property of consciousness itself. It's the energy generated by the fixation on the rival, the desire to overcome the block that the pour soi itself has empowered through imitation.
This hits right at Sartre's core idea. Existence precedes essence.
It does. Sartre argues that because there's no God to predefine human nature, we're born as pure potentiality, pure freedom, negation. We create our essence through our choices. His famous example is the garçon de café, the waiter in the cafe.
The waiter who plays the role too perfectly.
Yes. Sartre says the waiter, by adopting all the precise mannerisms and gestures of waiterness, is trying to become a thing, an en soi. He's trying to glue an essence onto his free existence. Sartre calls this bad faith, denying your fundamental freedom and choosing to be an object, an imitation.
So for Sartre, imitation is bad faith. It's inauthentic.
Essentially, yes. He sees mimesis, conforming to a role or model, as a kind of original sin against existential freedom. Authenticity means purging yourself of this otherness, this imitation, and defining yourself purely through your own negating choices.
And Girard's response.
Girard pushes back hard on two fronts. First, he says, wait a minute, mimesis isn't inherently bad. It's how we learn everything: language, skills, culture. Positive imitation is essential. You can't just dismiss it all as bad faith.
Okay. And the second point.
Second, and more fundamentally, Girard argues that Sartre's demand to purify existence of otherness in full is philosophically impossible and psychologically dangerous. The waiter isn't necessarily in bad faith just because he's imitating waiterness. He's only in bad faith, Girard might say, if he's trapped in a rivalrous imitation while simultaneously denying that he's imitating anyone at all.
So the problem isn't imitation itself, but unconscious conflictual imitation combined with the denial of that imitation.
Exactly. True freedom, for Girard, isn't found in some impossible project of pure negation or absolute originality. It's found in becoming conscious of our mimetic nature and deliberately choosing positive, non-violent models to imitate, rather than being swept away by the hidden currents of rivalry.
So Sartre, by defining freedom solely through negation, ends up inadvertently prescribing the very pathology of obstacle addiction as the path to authenticity.
He rationalizes the symptom, mistaking the destructive energy of rivalry for the creative energy of freedom. He locates inauthenticity in imitation itself, rather than in the conflictual dynamics that arise from unacknowledged imitation.
Okay, this brings us to the ultimate extreme, the point where this philosophy of the negative seems to collide most dramatically with human reality. The idea of suicide, not as an act of despair, but as the ultimate philosophical statement.
Yes, this is the absolute peak, or maybe the nadir, of the humanization of nothingness, the argument goes. If a person can choose death freely, deliberately, not out of illness or unbearable suffering, but as a pure act of will, that is the ultimate proof of human sovereignty.
It's like saying, I can negate even existence itself, therefore I am freer than any god who is bound by being.
Precisely. It seems to appropriate the power of nothingness to transcend all limitations. Kojev, again, was explicit. Voluntary death, undertaken without biological necessity, is the most obvious manifestation of negativity or freedom.
And literature, specifically Dostoevsky, explored this idea long before the philosophers codified it, with the character Kirillov in Demons, the Possessed.
Kirillov is the absolute archetype. He's not suicidal in the typical sense. He plans to kill himself for purely philosophical reasons, to prove that man can overcome the fear of death, thereby killing the fear of God and ushering in a new era, the era of the man-god. His suicide is meant to be a foundational act for atheistic humanism.
A self-chosen death to prove ultimate freedom and replace God.
That's the plan. It's a conscious, sovereign act of negation aimed at demonstrating that human finitude, embraced voluntarily, is the source of ultimate power.
And interestingly, Kojev actually engaged with Kirillov's story later, trying to salvage the philosophical point, even amidst the messy details Dostoevsky includes.
He did. Dostoevsky clearly portrays Kirillov's final moments as filled with terror and confusion, suggesting his motives might be more complex, perhaps rooted in shame or pride rather than pure philosophical logic. Kojev acknowledges this psychological aspect, but insists it doesn't matter philosophically.
How does he argue that?
Kojev says, even if Kirillov kills himself out of shame for not being able to do it purely out of principle, that shame itself is a uniquely human motivation. No animal commits suicide out of shame. Therefore, even a psychologically messy suicide, if voluntary, still proves man's absolute freedom, his transcendence of mere nature, and thus limits God's necessity. The philosophical concept trumps the human reality for Kojev.
But Girard reads Kirillov completely differently. He digs into the text and sees something Kojev completely missed or ignored.
Girard performs a brilliant close reading, showing that Kirillov isn't operating in a philosophical vacuum. His actions are saturated with mimetic rivalry, and who is his ultimate model obstacle?
Christ.
Explicitly Christ. Kirillov sees his suicide as a direct challenge to, and even a dark parody of, Christ's passion. He wants to correct redemption, to offer humanity a better death based on human pride, not divine sacrifice. He's not a self-sufficient originator. He's locked in an intense, agonistic imitation of the ultimate transcendent model. His desire is entirely mediated by his rivalry with Christ.
And those gory details that Kojev dismisses, the terror, the animalistic scream, the biting Girard, sees those as crucial evidence.
Absolutely crucial. For Girard, these aren't just unfortunate psychological blemishes on a pure philosophical act. They are the symptoms of the unbearable pressure of his mimetic obsession, his failed attempt to usurp divinity through sheer will. His final panic isn't the serenity of achieved freedom. It's the terror of realizing his self-deification has failed, the agony of profound self-hatred born from this ultimate obstacle addiction.
So, Girard concludes Kirillov's act isn't the superior suicide at all.
No, it's an ordinary suicide, Girard says, driven by the same dynamics of pride, resentment, and failed rivalry that fuel countless tragedies. It's the endpoint of pathological mimesis, not the dawn of philosophical freedom.
Yet, despite Dostoevsky's complex portrayal, someone like Albert Camus in The Myth of Sisyphus takes Kirillov and holds him up as a hero.
Yes, Camus abstracts Kirillov completely. He strips away the rivalry with Christ, ignores the manipulation by the nihilist Verkovensky, smooths over the terror and violence of the death scene. He presents Kirillov as this compelling, almost noble hero of the absurd.
Why? To fit his own philosophical narrative.
It seems so. Camus needs Kirillov to be the man who confronts the absurd and chooses revolt through sovereign self-destruction. He accuses Dostoevsky of flinching from the true consequences of Kirillov's logic. But for Girard, this is the perfect example of the philosophical discourse itself, engaging in bad faith, deliberately ignoring the concrete, human, mimetic reality of the situation to preserve the abstract ideal of freedom as negation.
It's the ultimate rationalization of the pathology. You have to ignore the actual person to celebrate the deadly idea.
You have to deny the mimetic dimension, the inescapable relatedness, the rivalry that actually drives the behavior. The philosophical celebration of nothingness, in this view, requires a profound blindness to the mechanisms of human desire itself. #tag outro.
Wow. Okay, that really was a deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from Hegel to Sartre to Dostoevsky, and Girard's central argument, cutting across all of it, seems devastatingly consistent.
It really is. His claim is that this whole philosophical edifice built around the negative, celebrating it as freedom, authenticity, the core of human being, is fundamentally a misdiagnosis. It's not insight, it's a symptom.
A symptom of our hidden, often unconscious entanglement in mimetic desire,
Yeah.
specifically in its conflictual rivalrous forms, that cycle of obstacle addiction.
Exactly. He argues that the philosophical fascination with nothingness, with negation, with death itself, is the intellectual reflection of a deeper human inability or unwillingness to escape these destructive patterns of rivalry and the pride that fuels them. The desire for absolute autonomy, for self-divinization, paradoxically leads us to embrace self-negation.
So if celebrating the negative is the wrong path, the path to, as he said, slavery and death, what's the alternative Girard offers? How do we find genuine freedom?
Well, it's not through a clever philosophical argument or a more refined dialectic. For Girard, the way out isn't intellectual in that sense. It requires something much more profound, more difficult. Conversion.
Conversion, meaning religious conversion.
It can be, but more fundamentally, it's a conversion away from the self-centeredness of pride and rivalry. It's the painful renunciation of the desire to be God, the death of pride, as he sometimes calls it. It involves recognizing our mimetic nature, our dependence on models.
And then consciously choosing different kinds of models.
Yes. True freedom, in Girard's framework, isn't the power to negate everything, to say no to the world. It's the capacity to consciously choose positive models of peace, forgiveness, non-rivalry, and to imitate them, to say yes to a different way of desiring and relating.
Which ties this whole critique into his broader Christian anthropology, doesn't it? Where the ultimate enemy isn't lack of freedom, but death itself.
Precisely. From that perspective, the philosophical fascination with nothingness, seeing death as somehow intrinsic to freedom or authenticity, is the ultimate dead end. It embraces the very thing that needs to be overcome. Remember 1 Corinthians, the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Sacralizing death, Girard suggests, just delays that necessary victory.
So it really forces a fundamental question back onto us, the listeners. If Girard is right, if our desires are never truly autonomous but always shaped by models, it makes you think.
It absolutely does. Where do you look for your models of what a good life is, of fulfillment? Who or what shapes your desires, maybe without you even realizing it?
And maybe even more pointedly, what obstacles, maybe people, maybe career goals, maybe ideologies, are you secretly, perhaps even pleasurably, fixated on? What negations are fueling your sense of self?
Is your feeling of freedom really about your power to negate, to reject, to be independent? Or could true freedom lie elsewhere in the conscious, positive choice of non-rivalrous models, in the capacity for good mimesis, for connection rather than conflict?
Definitely something to reflect on. Thank you for unpacking that complex argument with us.
My pleasure. It's challenging stuff, but incredibly relevant, I think.
Join us next time for another deep